The once stable and trusted silver denarius gradually lost its precious metal content. The emperors reduced the percentage of silver in these coins, replacing it with cheaper metals, while retaining the same face value. It was a form of currency debasement in ancient times, and an invisible tax in effect. In the short term, the state was thus able to pay soldiers and suppliers without raising explicit taxes. In the long run, however, it destroyed trust in money itself.
As debasement accelerated, so did prices. Soldiers wanted more wages, merchants marked prices up to hedge against uncertainty, and it became harder to collect taxes as economic activity slowed. The empire entered a vicious cycle of spending, which required still more debasement, inflation merely because one needed to pay even more. By the 3rd century, Roman currency had lost much of its credibility. Trade increasingly reverted to barter in some regions, and economic integration across the empire weakened. Military defeats certainly did take place, but they were often symptoms rather than causes.
Soldiers who were underpaid started to rebel more and supported rival claimants to the throne. Economically collapsing provinces could not support garrisons. Rome's borders became porous, but this was not because the barbarians suddenly got much stronger. Rather, it was because Rome grew poorer, less efficient, and less cohesive. The fall of Rome wasn't one event, but rather the gradual monetization of decline. The Ottoman Empire followed an almost identical path centuries later.
At the height of the Ottoman state, it controlled key trade routes between Europe and Asia, generating revenue from customs, land taxes, and tribute. For a very long time, this system was stable. Then, changes in the global economy started to erode it. In the 16th century, the flow of silver from the Americas into Europe triggered inflation that spread. Ottoman currency could not adjust because its value was pegged to old metal standards.
Like Rome, the Ottomans resorted to debasement. The silver content of the akçe was repeatedly reduced. Janissaries, the empire's elite corps of soldiers, pressed for higher wages to cover inflation. The state gave in and, to help pay the soldiers, raised taxes on already hard-pressed peasants and farmers. Tax farming became common, with private individuals bid for the right to extract revenue, often with a focus on short-term extraction over long-term sustainability.
This provided cash in the short run, but encouraged resentment and economic harm in the longer run. The Ottoman state also began to borrow more extensively, especially in its later centuries. Military modernization entailed expensive imports of such things as weapons, ships, and technology bought from the European powers. Such purchases were often financed through debt, further draining state revenues. By the 19th century, the empire was spending a large part of its revenue just paying off the interest on these obligations.
In this manner, sovereignty over finances eroded, with foreign creditors gaining ascendancy. Once more, military defeats followed from fiscal weakness. An underfunded army could not compete with industrialized European forces. Infrastructure fell behind. Administrative corruption abounded as salaries lost value.
Well, before the Ottoman Empire was formally dissolved after World War I, its economic foundations had long since been hollowed out. The empire didn't collapse because it lost one war. It collapsed because it lost control of its money. The British Empire is a rather more modern, subtle case. Britain did not have hyperinflation or currency collapse in the same dramatic fashion as Rome or the Ottomans. Instead, its decline was shaped by debt, overextension, and changing structure of world finance.
Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars deeply indebted but still dominant. The Industrial Revolution and global trade allowed Britain to service that debt while expanding imperial control. However, the two world wars transformed Britain's financial position. Financing total war required massive borrowing, especially from the United States. The gold reserves were depleted.
Overseas assets had been sold. By 1945, Britain was military victor, but financially spent. Running an empire simply became unaffordable. Colonial administration, military presence, and reconstruction costs ran head-on into a domestic economy worn down. Unlike earlier empires, Britain made a choice. It could have held on to empire by force. Instead, it negotiated much of it away. Decolonization wasn't just ideological, it was fiscal. The empire did not pay for itself anymore. Sterling lost its position as the world's #1.
Reserve currency, yielding pride of place to the US dollar.
Without monetary dominance, imperial dominance wasn't possible anymore. Britain's case makes the essential point. An empire can suffer the loss of global power without losing battles. When financial primacy recedes, strategic options contract. Military power rests on financial credibility. If creditors, markets, and allies have lost their faith in an empire's ability to sustain itself, then its grip on power weakens, even if its armies are still victorious on the field. The United States represents the most recent and still unfolding chapter in this story. Unlike previous empires, the U.S. has built its power upon monetary dominance as much as territorial control.
The dollar's role as the global reserve currency extends a set of quite extraordinary advantages to the United States. It can borrow cheaply, run persistent deficits, and finance military and social spending at scales which would cripple other nations. This system allows the U.S. to project power without formal colonies. Yet this privilege carries risks. Chronic deficits beget debt.
Monetary expansion, although less demonstratively destructive than ancient debasement, persistently degrades purchasing power. Confidence in the dollar is maintained not through metal content, but rather confidence in institutions, political stability, and economic productivity. Should that continue to fade, the implications could be immense. History suggests that monetary dominance is never permanent. Rome's silver failed. The Ottoman akçe failed. Sterling failed. Each was once considered indispensable. Each was eventually replaced. The United States differs in important ways. Its economy is larger, more innovative, and more integrated into global systems, but it is not immune to the same structural pressures. Rising debt, political polarization, and the weaponization of financial systems all test the durability of monetary trust. A consistent pattern emerges across these cases. Empires rise through efficient systems of taxation, trade, and money. They fall when those systems become distorted by the imperatives of maintaining scale. Military power accelerates the process, but rarely initiates it.
Armies are costly, frontiers are expensive, bureaucracies expand. When economic productivity can no longer sustain imperial obligations, states resort to expedients, debasement, debt, financial repression. These expedients put off collapse, but make it more complete. The illusion of military causation endures because wars are loud and vivid. Financial decay is silent, technical, and dull to describe. But it is the financial factor that determines how long armies may march, how well borders can be guarded, and how loyal populations remain. Money is the lifeblood of empire. When it weakens, faraway provinces are first to feel the pain, but the malady originates at the core. And empires do not handle success well either. Power means greater complexity, more administrative systems, competing elites, and political incentives for short-term stability at the expense of long-term sustainability. Rarely do leaders voluntarily choose austerity when monetary tools are available that allow them to shift consequences beyond their time in office. It is this political economy of empire that ensures decline is managed, not prevented. The rise and fall of empires are therefore not morality tales, nor is it anything as simple as some cycle of conquest and defeat.
It is a financial story grounded in incentives, in institutions, and ultimately in trust. Money is far more than a medium of exchange. It is a social contract. When that contract loses coherence, no army can quite compensate. The monetary gaze also reframes the present in understanding imperial decline. It fosters skepticism of a military focus or technological superiority as sole vehicles for explaining rise and fall. It underlines fiscal discipline, productive investment, and institutional credibility. And it reminds us that power, once accumulated, is easier to spend than to sustain. Empires fall long before their flags are lowered. They fall when their currencies lose meaning, when debt replaces productivity, and when financial promises exceed economic reality. The battlefield may mark the end, but the balance sheet writes the story.